Economic Empowerment Subcommittee meeting. The Economic Empowerment Subcommittee is in conjunction with the African American Task Force, and the African American Task Force was created as part of the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus's Justice for All agenda. I am your chair, Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker, and thank you for joining us on today. At this time, I shall turn over the meeting to Ms. Del Callo for a roll call, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Sherry Dorsey Walker.
Present.
Siobhan White. Charlie Weatherspoon.
Present.
Kyle Myers. Louie Morley.
Present.
Dr. Melinda Hudson. Jane Hovington. Representative Larry Lambert.
Present.
Dr. Dan Young.
Present.
Dr. Brittany Hazard.
Present.
Clay Hammond. Eunice Guamesia. Derek Deadweiler. Secretary Carol Hubbard. Secretary Hubbard, are you with us?
Yes,
Karen
I'm present.
Wonderful, thank you. Karen Burton. Representative Michael Smith. Representative Bill Bush. Representative Medina Wilson Anton.
Present.
That concludes the attendance roll call. We have 8 members present. We do not yet have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Del Callo. Ms. Callo, when we do quorum, feel free to reach out to me to let me know so we can approve the minutes.
Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate you. What I'd like to do now is jump right into our discussion. Today's topic is removing licensing barriers for occupations. And we have 2 members of CSG with us today, Michelle Feldman and Joshua Gaines, as well as Martin Harris, excuse me. And CSG is the Council for State Governments. At this time, I shall turn it over to Michelle Feldman, followed by Martin Harris, then Joshua Gaines. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. And we appreciate being invited here today. And so again, my name is Michelle Feldman, and I'm with the Council for State Governments Justice Center. And my colleagues from our economic mobility team are with me, Martin Harris and Josh Gaines. So just a little background on Council for State Governments Justice Center. So Council for State Governments is a membership organization, and we're made up of officials from the legislative, executive, and judicial branches from all 50 states. And the Justice Center is specifically focused on helping states to improve their criminal justice systems. And the economic mobility team that we are all on helps states to identify and reduce barriers to work for people with criminal records. And right now, with so many states focused on rebuilding their economies after the pandemic and getting people back to work, we launched a national initiative to help state legislatures improve access to licensed professions. Even though access to licensed work is just one part of an equitable economic recovery, it could really have an outsized impact. First, licensed jobs tend to be more stable and higher paying than unlicensed professions. Second, we all know that gainful employment is a key factor in successful reentry, and that means improved public safety for everybody. And third, it helps businesses to access a pipeline of qualified and specialized talent. There are many in-demand positions. Right now, there's a construction boom, and those positions need to be filled with people with specialized skills. And just to give you a sense of the scope of licensed professions in Delaware, those jobs make up about 15% of the state's workforce. And you need a license for a range of jobs, including to be a barber, to be a plumber, to be a real estate agent. And the Office of Professional Regulation oversees licensing for most occupations in Delaware. And a couple of years ago, the agency was part of a multi-state licensing consortium that worked with 16 other states, and it was funded by the Department of Labor and staffed by CSG. And the goal was to share best practices to improve licensing access and opportunities to various groups. And one of Delaware's goals was to focus on justice impacted people and ways to make the process easier for them and ensure that they were not unfairly excluded. So this is an issue that's been discussed a lot in Delaware, and we have been working with the Office of Professional Regulation and also with Representative Melissa Minor Brown on legislation that would achieve that goal. We're hoping it will be introduced before the end of session, but if not, we hope we will see it in 2022. So why is access to licensed professions so important to people with criminal records? This chart just shows the enormity of unemployment for formerly incarcerated people. It's over 1/4 of people who were in prison do not have jobs. And those that do have jobs tend to be working in the most unstable and lowest wage professions. And licensed work just provides better employment options. On average, licensed jobs pay higher salaries. There's more opportunity for career growth. There's more opportunity to start your own business and become an entrepreneur. There's also typically a lower barrier to entry in these jobs. You don't necessarily need a high school or a college degree to become a realtor. For example, you need to take 99 hours of coursework and pass a series of exams in Delaware. And third, there's a vocational pipeline of talent being developed in Delaware prisons right now. The Department of Corrections has a program for training in construction trades, and that can start people on a path to becoming plumbers or electricians or HVAC repairmen. So it's important that once those folks get out of prison, they have that skill set, and then they need to be able to get that license so that they can enter the occupation and really maximize their potential. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Martin Harris, and he's going to dive a bit more into the racial and social justice impact of fair chance licensing. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to speak to you all here today about occupational licensing. First, I just want to acknowledge and give credit to one of the leading voices on mass incarceration and its impact on the African-American community that's comprised in prison populations across the country. I'm sure all of you are aware of the new Jim Crow, but it really framed the issue of mass incarceration and the direct collateral consequences that are tied to it. And we all know that there are high rates of unemployment that are tied to those collateral consequences as well. And our economy suffers as a result of not employing people who are qualified to work, regardless of their criminal history background. So one of the ways that we're focused on reducing those barriers is focusing on providing easier pathways to receiving an occupational license. Right now, the current landscape of the Delaware prison population has significantly increased over the past few decades. It's roughly at around 3,768 people within the Delaware prison system. And a vast majority of that prison population consists of African Americans, even though that they only make up less than 1/4 of the general population within the state of Delaware. So we could see that it's having a disproportionate impact on the African American community, and finding those ways to provide employment and economic mobility is something that we're very focused on. In addition to kind of the current landscape going on, this is a graphic about unemployment rates, specifically within the ages of 35 to 44, which are the prime working years that we're seeing across the board for those who are formerly incarcerated. The darker blue graphic is the statistic in comparison to the general population that does not have a criminal history of unemployment. And we can see that it's disproportionately affecting Black women and Black men when they have that criminal background. The numbers of unemployment are vastly superior to those of white women and white men. So understanding those disparities when we see those collateral consequences that are tied to folks who belong to the African-American community. Some of the pathways that Delaware has in place is the APEX program, and we've actually reached out to a representative of that program, and they're doing great work in terms of navigating those barriers by issuing expungements and pardons. This is very helpful when looking for employment and opportunities upon release. A vast majority of those applications deal with pardons. Expungements are a lot more rigorous. In Kent and Sussex counties, 66% of those people who asked for a pardon or expungement were from communities of color. So we know that a large portion of that is comprised of African Americans that make up 23% of that POC community. So just going off of what Michelle said, you all already have a great commission that's focused on improving vocational programs so that people have the skills to be employed once they are released. We all know that a large portion, almost 100% of the prison population in Delaware re-enters back into society. So making sure that they're equipped with the skills to build a life for themselves and find employment and have access to those occupational licenses are critically important. And prison education programs are known to kind of reduce rates of recidivism. And we're seeing trends across the country establishing bachelor's programs. I know Georgetown University recently established an education program in the state of Maryland and some of their prison populations. So having those programs in place are critically important for employment opportunities in the future. So now I want to hand it over to Josh Gaines, who will talk about the fair chance licensing landscape in Delaware. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks so much to the committee for giving us some time here today and for giving some thought to this issue. What I want to do is go through where Delaware stands currently as far as conviction-based barriers to licensure go and where it might improve, specifically with regard to what states across the country have been doing on this issue. So just to start off with, there are 225 provisions of Delaware statute and regulation that create barriers to occupational and professional licensure for people with criminal histories. Of those, 124 of those barriers have to be imposed without exception if a person has a disqualifying conviction. And of those 225, 181 of them persist indefinitely. That is, the law has no expiration date on a person being subject to that. So you could imagine someone, having a shoplifting offense at age 20 and 20 years later at age 40, applying for licensure. If they would be subject to a disqualification, they're going to remain subject to that disqualification. So these things can really cause lifelong problems. Delaware has a lot of licensed fields, much like every other state in the country. Michelle mentioned a lot of them. This is just a small sampling of them. And most of them will have some sort of criminal conviction-based barrier to obtaining initial licensure. And I want to stress initial licensure here as opposed to revoking or suspending the license of a person who's already in the profession, right, and subject to higher standards. These are people who are just trying to get in the door there. So this list, like just a sampling, as I mentioned, most healthcare related fields are included here: accounting, dental hygienists, things that you would expect. But there's a lot of more kind of trade, low barrier work here that is being kept from people with criminal histories due to their convictions. So you have, for example, plumbing, heating and air conditioning techs, land surveying, home inspection, barbering, all of these sorts of things. So the range of occupations affected really just runs the gamut. So Delaware has taken steps to improve opportunities for people with convictions in this context. And it tracks to some degree some major themes that we see across the country as far as fair chance licensing is concerned. The major goals of fair chance licensing policies are to maximize opportunity for people with convictions, to maintain public safety, of course. So we're not talking about just opening the floodgates and letting everyone do anything regardless of their criminal history. Treating applicants as individuals, increasing transparency in the process, and then reducing the burden on applicants with convictions who have to navigate this very complicated and daunting process. So Delaware's fair chance licensing laws are really scattered throughout the codes, which is a bit unique as well. Most states have sort of a consolidated rule that covers all licensing practices in the state. Delaware does it on an individual level, but it's pretty consistent, in how it's treated across the board. Those laws are the result of a pair of acts that were enacted, one in 2004 and another in 2009 that built upon that earlier act. And the way it generally works is there is a statutory prohibition on disqualifying a person due to a conviction that does not bear a substantial relationship to the licensed activity. But it's important to know that that substantial relationship is not determined on a case-by-case basis. The way the law works is it tells every board to promulgate in its regulations a list of specific offenses that it considers substantially related per se. And if you have one of those offenses, you are disqualified from licensure, unless you get a waiver from the board itself. So it's really, sort of a presumption up front. Unless you go and seek that waiver and receive that waiver, if you have an offense on the list, you're not getting a license. The waivers are problematic in a few ways. One is they're not always available. There's a 5-year waiting period that generally applies if you have a felony conviction before you can even ask for a waiver. That's not a 5-year waiting period to get the license or something like that. It's just to seek a waiver. And there's really little in the way of objective or consistent, transparent standards to guide boards' consideration of when a waiver should be granted. There's two really broad criteria that they have to consider. One is whether the person is capable of practicing in a competent and professional manner. And the other is whether they will endanger the public safety or welfare. I would suggest that neither of those standards is clear and consistent and able to be applied in a way that results in really fair consideration, and more problematically, in a way that allows people who need a waiver, who want a waiver, to understand what's going to be considered and what they need to do to make their case for that consideration. And I do want to stop here for just a second, as I'm sort of piling on with respect to the current law here. But what we understand from the Department of Professional Regulation is that people who seek the waivers generally get them. And really, that's the case in most states that we talk with. It's certainly not a universal, but most licensing boards, especially with big umbrella agencies overseeing them, like the Department of Regulation here in Delaware, are pretty reasonable when it comes to considering these things. What they don't see are the number of people who don't apply for licensure because these barriers are there, and because of the assumption that they will be denied, because of the uncertainty about whether they will be denied. And I do want to highlight some smaller recent reforms that were undertaken in Delaware. In 2019, a few a few licenses those laws were amended to increase access a bit. Those include massage therapy, plumbing and HVAC techs, electricians, and barbers and cosmetologists. Those changes generally put a 10-year conviction-free look-back limitation on consideration of conviction. So after 10 years, it couldn't be considered and you couldn't be disqualified. It also lowered the waiting period to seek a waiver from that 5-year period for a felony to 2 to 3 years, depending on the specific felony. So there has been, some movement in the state, which is certainly encouraging. Now, I mentioned the way things work is every board has to say these offenses, with specific reference to what they are in the code, are substantially related to the license. And that sounds good in theory. In practice, it's a little bit surprising. It was to us, and we look at this stuff pretty often. What's ended up happening is that boards, because there's no guidance, there's no standards to tell them how to make that substantial relationship determination. They have created extremely long lists of presumptively disqualifying offenses, and many offenses on those lists have a questionable relationship to the licensed occupation or profession. And I want to give you an example of this. This is pulled straight out of the regulations promulgated by the board that oversees licensing of addiction counselors. These are the presumptively disqualifying offenses that are in the law. And I encourage you, for any, if you're interested, for any licensed occupation in the state, you can go and pull up these lists and the regs, and they're really eye-opening. We didn't pick, the biggest one to share with you here, the longest list. They're all pretty substantial. And you can see there's a lot here. This is not an error. This is not a duplicate slide. This is just more of those offenses. The list goes on. So, you see some violent stuff, but you see theft, identity theft, some arson offenses, those sorts of things. And there's more. Forgery. We're talking about addiction counselors, by the way, and offenses that are substantially related to addiction counseling. Insurance fraud, healthcare fraud, receiving bribes. More. Bribing a juror, tampering with a witness, perjury. More. This is all the same list. Right? I just want to be very clear about that. And more. And this is really interesting because these are all drug offenses. And these are people who are entering the addiction counseling profession to be licensed. Many of the people who feel like calling to that profession are people who have struggled with and overcome these sorts of things in their own lives. And frankly, in many cases, those are the sorts of people who are best positioned to provide advice and guidance to others struggling through those. Just to put a human face on it, this picture right here is of a man named Miko Lincoln, who is a formerly incarcerated recovering addict in Rhode Island. The Washington Post in 2019 did a great profile on him. He's seeking his professional addiction counselor license in Rhode Island. If you Google his name in Washington Post, it'll be the first hit you get if you're interested. I really encourage you to read it. It's very eye-opening. But he has been working, he's working towards getting his counseling license. He doesn't know, and things may have changed, this was 2019, of course, but I'm speaking in the present tense. He doesn't know if he can get it, right? But he's doing what he can in the meantime. And while he's working towards that license, he's providing addiction treatment services and guidance at the very same halfway house that helped him overcome his addiction after he was incarcerated. So he's basically doing the same sort of job, interacting with the same sort of people, doesn't need a license to do it, but to get that licensed credential to slightly expand his scope of practice and to make more money, he's got to deal with this conviction-based hurdle. We're not done. More addiction counselor. These are all new offenses on the list. All told, it's 182 presumptively disqualifying offenses. And like I said, this list is not an anomaly in its exhaustiveness. We see this for all sorts of occupations. Operating a boat while under the influence of intoxicating liquor. So what can Delaware learn from the rest of the country about how to sort of overcome some of these issues, how to increase transparency, how to increase opportunity, and at the same time protect public safety? There are lots of best practices that we've been talking with, for example, Representative Minor Brown about, and the Department of Professional Regulation. I want to go over just a few of what we really consider to be, and what other states consider to be, very foundational sort of stuff that is lacking currently in Delaware statutes. The first is a pre-application eligibility determination. Now, what this is a statutorily mandated process that allows workers to obtain a decision about whether their conviction will be disqualifying at any time. So that's even before they meet the general requirements for licensure or begin their relevant education. Now, I'm gonna kind of do a little thought experiment real quick, just to kind of hammer home the importance of this. Let's imagine we have a forgery conviction, right? We want to be a barber or a cosmetologist. That's something we're good at. It's something we're interested in. It's something that we see ourselves, creating some financial and economic security and independence for ourselves. The calculus goes like this. I have to spend 1 to 2 years getting my education or apprenticeship training, which is required by Delaware law, 1,500 hours classroom training or 3,000 hours apprenticeship training. If I'm going to school, I have to pay $20,000 in tuition and expenses. But because of that, I have a forgery conviction, which is on that list. All of that could be for absolutely nothing, because I have no way of knowing before I make that investment, before I spend that money, before I spend that time, whether I will ultimately be denied. And in fact, until I get a waiver, which I can't even seek until I fill out that application and complete all these requirements, I will be denied, right? I mean, it's presumptive. So there's a huge deterrent effect with these lists, and the fact that people can't get an answer up front before they invest this time. Cosmetology is a low barrier field when it comes to licensure. I want to point out there are many people in similar situations where the cost, the time are massive. If you want to be an addiction counselor, for example, to go back to that, that's a master's degree and hundreds and hundreds of hours of in practice training and experience. Same's true, plumbing, electricians, all of these sorts of things, and you got to do it up front and just keep your fingers crossed and hold your breath. With that risk assessment in mind, you can see the deterrent effect of these laws on people who could do the job well, who could do the job safely, and who probably, frankly, if they were to put all that stuff in up front, would get the license, but they have no way of knowing. These policies have really taken hold in recent years. There's 19 states that have them in place. We say there are 2 states where these policies are partially implemented. That's Nevada and Kansas. Both of them, they create the process, but they explicitly state that the decision you get about whether your criminal history is disqualifying is non-binding when you actually go to file your application, which kind of undermines the entire point, which is to create certainty about create certainty that allows you to plan your career path. The next big one, and I'll go through these a little more briefly, is just individualized consideration guided by statutory factors. This is pretty common sense stuff, and what it's meant to do is ensure that no offense is automatically disqualifying, and make sure that people and their conduct underlying their offenses are considered on a case-by-case basis. So everyone gets a chance. Everyone gets a chance to show that they're competent, that they can do the job safely, that there's no threat to public safety. And the way this usually works is, the law will say that you can't disqualify someone unless a crime bears a relationship to the licensed activity, and then it'll list a bunch of common sense factors that are meant to guide that determination. So we're talking about things like the nature and seriousness of the offense, age of the conviction, evidence of rehabilitation and other mitigating circumstances, and so forth. And this is really, kind of the linchpin of fair chance licensing. Everything else, to a certain extent is just about bolstering this general idea that people should be treated fairly and treated consistently and be given a shot. So 26 states now have these laws in effect. There are 10 that we say have partially implemented those laws. Those states are just ones that don't have as robust a list of factors that must be considered. And you can see Delaware is among the 14 states that have not yet gone this route. Finally, and this is pretty straightforward, broad limits on the consideration of older convictions. We know that the risk of reoffense dramatically drops after just a few years without criminal justice involvement. So a number of states have taken that to heart and incorporated that idea into their licensing laws, basically saying we're not going to consider any conviction, in the past 3 to 10 years is generally the range that states are in, if you haven't, received a subsequent conviction during that time. And this isn't unprecedented in Delaware. These conversations, have been happening at least up until 2019, when they imposed a 10-year limitation for just a few of those licenses we discussed early, massage therapy, barbering and cosmetology, and some of those trades, plumbing and electricians. Again, you can see the states here, 11 have fully implemented, 8 have partially implemented this. Partial implementation here means, for the most part, that the time limits only apply to a certain subset of convictions. So perhaps, violent felonies would be exempt, could be considered at any time, but anything else would be subject to a look back period limitation. And there are a few more these best practices, not as foundational, mainly procedural in nature, but they really go towards creating accountability, creating consistency, and ensuring that the process is actually followed. So this includes procedures for notice and reconsideration of criminal history-based denials that are specific to those sorts of denials, limiting consideration of lower level offenses. Many states say we're not going to consider any nonviolent misdemeanors at all. Don't even bother putting it on your record. That doesn't interest us. Explicitly prohibiting consideration of non-conviction records, expunged and pardoned convictions. This is done as a matter of policy, but it's quite unclear in the law and not incorporated into the conviction-based licensing standards for each profession. And finally, public information sharing. And this goes back to that issue of deterrence, making sure that workers know where they stand, know how they'll be considered when they enter this difficult to navigate pathway. We are here to help. We've been working in Delaware. We've had the great pleasure, as I mentioned, of working with Representative Minor Brown, working with folks at the Department of Professional Regulation, talking about best practices, trying to develop targeted solutions to Delaware. And we would love to have any conversations with you all that you might be interested in about these issues. We look forward to talking with other stakeholders going forward as we continue our work in the state. And if you'd like to reach out, here's our contact information. We would love to hear from you and very happy to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank all of you, Ms. Feldman, Mr. Harris, Mr. Gaines, for outstanding presentations. I was a little bit floored. Not too much surprises me about the addiction situation and mental health and the not being able to obtain your license with some of the issues that individuals endure when they're going through addiction. Everything that was listed are things that addicts do, and most of it is crimes of moral turpitude, some of it, because they're trying to survive the illness that has fallen upon them. And I'm just grateful that you've opened our eyes on today. Do any of the members of the committee have any questions?
Madam
And I would
Chair,
like to, yes, ma'am.
I wanted to let you know we did reach quorum. we are joined by Dr. Melinda Hudson. We unfortunately have had tech issues trying to promote her to a panelist. Dr. Hudson, I did email you and reach out to you on your cell phone with some suggested instructions so that we can get you on our panelist list. But even if we can't, we can certainly unmute you to that way you can make comments or, vote to approve meeting minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Del Carlo. Greatly appreciated. Now that we have reached quorum, we just take 30 seconds and shift for the acceptance of the minutes from the April 8th, 2021 meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
So moved. To approve, Rick Deadweiler.
Thank you, Mr. Deadweiler. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Representative Lambert. All in favor, salute by staying on mute with your silence. The minutes have been approved. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Ms. Del Carlo, for that information. Did any members of the committee have any questions for our guests, Ms. Feldman, Mr. Harris, or Mr. Gaines? Representative Lambert?
Yes. Hello, Michelle, Martin, and Josh. I want to thank you so much for your presentation on removing licensing barriers. I too was definitely surprised by some of that information. I wanted to know if you had any data around recidivism rates. I know that Delaware ranks pretty high among states for recidivism rates, and I didn't know if there may be a correlation between removing licensing barriers if some of those states have lower recidivism rates. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have anything handy right now, but it has been looked at by an academic that actually worked as a part of that occupational licensing consortium with us that Michelle mentioned. I believe it's national in scope, but the bottom line is that to the extent that people can get stable jobs that'll support their families, recidivism rates, generally plummet. It's not, the silver bullet by any means, especially when we're dealing, obviously with behavioral health issues, mental health issues, so many different sorts of things, just racial inequities, the subject of this committee. But employment is consistently identified as a key factor in reducing recidivism. And I'll try to dig some of that up, and I'd be happy to share that with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Committee Member Deadweiler was trying to speak.
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate this topic. I thought it was, and thank you to the presenters. Very, very informative. I think, to the earlier topic, often we're not surprised by much, but some of the barriers that you highlighted, and particularly, the addiction counselor, as it just serves as an example. I imagine there are others, and the barriers that are placed. It speaks to antiquated policy that a fresh set of legislative leaders who are considering these issues can take full advantage of making Delaware and other places a more positive and productive places to live, work, and raise children and families. So I say all that to say, a question for the panelists. It sounds like there was some conversation, interaction, discussion with legislators in Delaware, namely Representative Minor Brown, possibly others. Are there any target opportunities that have been highlighted as maybe antiquated policy or licensures that we should consider engaging for change? I just offer as any opportunities we should be thinking about.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. So we are really looking at addressing it in a holistic, all professions kind of legislation. Delaware has opened up professions only in specific areas. So they've reduced some barriers to be a barber or to be a real estate agent, but in most other states, there's uniform kind of guidance about how to treat criminal records for all professions. And that would really benefit Delaware, because, you know, licensing boards are not public safety experts. They shouldn't be expected to, you know how to place criminal records in context. And that's where a statute that really guides the boards about how to assess the record is so important. So our bill is in drafting right now. Things are, you know, the end of session, things get really backed up, but we're hoping to see a bill. And if it doesn't happen in 2021, certainly in 2022, that uniformly addresses occupations across the board to make sure that convictions are weighed properly.
Thank you, Ms.
Excellent.
Feldman.
Thank you. It's great to hear that approach. That sounds like an appropriate approach. And although an unelected, you know, a member to this body, certainly available to help in any way from my seat as a corporate affairs lead. It sounds like a great approach, and look forward to hearing and seeing more about that legislation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's great.
Committee Member Deadweiler. And Ms. Feldman, just as an FYI, we are so grateful that you've been working with Representative Minor Brown, who's also a member of the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus. And we have Representative Medina Wilson Anton and Representative Lambert and myself, who would be willing to work with you as well. I know I'm speaking for them, but I know that they are sincere about social justice issues. But I don't believe I'm speaking out of term. If I was, they would be raising their hands right now.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We're really grateful, and we will love to follow up. The more support we can build, the better. So thank you for that offer.
Absolutely. Committee Member Dr. Brittany Hazard has her hand raised. Dr. Hazard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Representative Dorsey Walker and Michelle, Martin, and Josh. What a vast amount of information. I'm over here writing notes, and you know, I'm blown away. And I tell you, I appreciate what you've shared. I guess my question is, if you look at Delaware overall, where do you think we are, honestly, with moving forward to address these inequities? So naturally, in my mind, when you speak about the gentleman mentioning about recidivism rates, and we talk about those who have been incarcerated, about opportunities, how that cycles around to mental health concerns, and the cycle continues. You know, you go back in, you know, you don't get the help, you get out, you don't have the opportunity. Where are we with empowering and providing opportunities for these individuals if we still have barriers such as these? So pretty much my question is, where do you feel like we are as a state, honestly, with moving forward and kind of reaching, crossing these barriers or breaking down these barriers? Because I grew up in an area where you often do see individuals who were incarcerated get out, they go right back. But they also struggle with mental health issues. And then before you know it, they don't feel as though there is any opportunity for them anywhere. If we don't have individuals advocating on their behalf, then they are going to fall beside, you know, to the wayside. And I feel like that's a disservice, at least from, you know, the work that I do. So I just wanted you guys to speak to that, if any one of you could.
Wow. It's an incredibly complicated issue. You know, it's like we mentioned before, it's, you know, employment is not the linchpin. It's a million, you know, different things that are all intersecting at the same time. And it's, you know, it's like trying to untangle Christmas lights to sort of see where, you know, the lines are for everything and how it really all connects together. You know, the way we look at it here at the CSG Justice Center is, you know, we take specific approaches to specific problems that we're able to identify. So, you know, we are the economic mobility team, and that's, you know, what we really focus on, those sorts of issues. We have a workforce, you know, development side to that. We also have behavioral health, you know, policing, courts experts who are all, you know, struggling with these same sorts of issues. I say all that partly to say that I don't think, and Martin or Michelle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we really have enough expertise to speak beyond the occupational licensing space. But I definitely encourage you to reach out to the Justice Center, more broadly for some of the more complex issues. What I will say is, if we're talking about licensing specifically, and we can talk a little bit beyond licensing if you'd like, Delaware has a lot of work to do. Those maps that I showed earlier, those aren't, kind of, niche novel ideas, really. They're really fundamental to creating a fair process when it comes to people with criminal convictions. And of course, the impact on the Black community there is far outweighs that on the white community due to any number of reasons that I'm sure you all have discussed and understand. Just being able to be considered as a person, knowing that when you put your application in, or this, or have an opportunity to seek a determination before you file an application, that you're going to be considered consistently, right? That it's not a black box that you can just have this sort of stigma that's also the result of years and years of issues. Weighing you down is hugely important, and states have tackled this beyond just licensing. They've looked at and developed workable policies that improve access to private employment, to public employment, for example. Essentially saying that public employers can't discriminate against people because of a conviction, just as they wouldn't be able to because of race or gender or anything like that. And there's not a lot there in Delaware. Aside from the licensing stuff. So I think there's work to be done, but the good news is there's a lot of states that have already done it. This isn't reinventing the wheel. It's really kind of assessing what's worked elsewhere and figuring out how to make that work in Delaware. And that's one of the things we've been talking to the Department of Professional Regulation about, and with Representative Minor Brown and hopefully some of you all here in the future.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Josh. And just to add to that, I mean, Delaware's pretty out of step in the fact that it requires a waiver for all of these endless lists of convictions that you start wondering what is not, listed on here as something you need to get a waiver for. So there's that big deterrent effect. And what happens is that you end up with people with criminal records who are locked into low wage professions or no profession at all. They're deterred from even seeking out a career path that, would require a license down the line. So, as you said, it's really gets to be cyclical. There's no opportunity, there's no hope. Every door closes. And then that is, the cycle of recidivism. That's what really drives it. So starting to open up access to employment and economic stability and opportunity is really so essential to addressing the problem.
Yeah, and just to add to what Michelle and Josh are saying, Delaware, there's definitely some room and opportunity to improve in these areas that they've laid out. But what I have seen is that Delaware is making strides in terms of the vocational programs, especially over the past few years. There's been an emphasis on that. And it was pretty easy to navigate on the website, the commission that's dedicated to kind of establishing these programs and broadening them. So I do think that there's opportunity to grow in those areas, but for all the reasons that Michelle and Josh just said, there are areas that in the fair chance licensing scope that definitely need to get improved.
Thank you for your candor. And again, we'd just like to share with you that each and every member of this subcommittee has a willingness and a commitment to work with you to help change the course of our future for our constituents by working together. If there aren't any other questions or concerns, before we conclude, I would like to go to Representative Larry Lambert. He does have a bill that could potentially be helpful with what we discussed today, and that's House Bill 205. Representative Lambert, if you don't mind just taking about 5 minutes and talking to our committee and sharing with the community about your bill and how CSG members can work with you to bring about the necessary changes in our state.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, I want to thank you, CSG members, for your presentation and for your continued support of meaningful legislation in Delaware. And I also want to thank the fellow members on the call. One of our fellow members, State Treasurer Colleen Davis, has worked with me on House Bill 205, which is known as the Delaware EARNS program. EARNS stands for Expanding Access to Retirement and Needful Savings. This program provides a state-facilitated, universally available retirement savings plan. We're in a space in Delaware where 50% of Delawareans are concerned that they won't have enough money to retire with. And also we're in a space where 54% of businesses do not offer an employer-facilitated retirement savings plan. This bill provides that universally available retirement savings plan so that whether you're a barber or picking up a broom at the dollar store, regardless of your socioeconomic background, you will have access to a retirement savings plan that is mobile. It can go with you to any business, whether you're self-employed, but also it provides opportunities for Delawareans to access this program where historically we haven't had that access. One of the things, being a member of the African American Task Force and being a part of this Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, is we look for equity and opportunities for that. And one of the things that I advocated for was to see if we might be able to have Black-owned wealth management firms handle some of the monies. Specifically, it was a topic that was brought up in one of our meetings. So I got good news that we're working on a friendly amendment that would expand that opportunity. So more to come on that. And Madam Chair, I really do appreciate this opportunity. I just want to encourage everyone to keep an eye out for that amendment we're working on, and to consider reviewing the legislation and encouraging your legislators to support it. House Bill 205. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Lambert. And if Treasurer Davis is available, Madam Treasurer, we want to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about the bill and how it can benefit the state of Delaware.
Madam Chair, I don't think the treasurer is with us today.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. Excellent job. Any questions? Any questions, concerns, anything you want to bring to our attention? Oh, I'm sorry, Secretary Hubbard.
Hi, I just wanted to mention I appreciate the presentation. It was very illuminating to me. I knew that there were a number of barriers with respect to licensing, but you know, it was very eye-opening to know that there are so many barriers. So the one thing I wanted to add is just we are in our budget for this year. We're hoping to, in fact, double the amount of dollars that we spend annually on the APEX program, because it's such a helpful piece for individuals who are coming out and getting those pardons and expungements. But, you know, again, I feel that we do need to double down on the pardon aspect because it will help individuals be able to maneuver beyond some of those offenses. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention was when I was at the kids department, we had a criminal history unit that specifically had guidelines as to who could be a foster parent, who could work with children. And so they did a separate screening of individuals based on their criminal history records and post records, and just took a bigger picture look than just what was on paper. So I'm not sure if ProReg does something similar, have a special unit that can, you know, ferret out some information about the individual, but then perhaps leave it up to an employer to decide whether or not they want to bring that person on, or if it's just an all or nothing with these offenses that are listed. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Del Calo, am I missing? Oh, I'm sorry, committee member, Dr. Brittany Hazard. I believe you have your hand raised.
Thank you so much for you guys' feedback. It is very encouraging to know that you guys are such a work you are. I've worked with you across the juvenile justice system. So when I looking at the statistics and, you know, knowing what when we do plans for their future, it'll be great to see how Delaware grows in this direction to breaking down some of these barriers, because then that adds hope to what they can do and the opportunities that they have going forward. So again, thank you all very much for your feedback. I appreciate it.
I just want to make sure I'm not missing any of the committee member, Mr. Deadweiler.
Yes, I just wanted to make comment on Representative Lambert's role in helping to lead with the Delaware Earns legislation. Fantastic. Thank you. You are 100% correct, sir. We have had several conversations with the task force as it relates to the wealth management opportunity that's connected here in Delaware. And to hear that the Delaware Earns Act that also provides access for folks to, you know, prepare for wealth retirement who wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity. But on the front end, you know, working to focus on having, you know, wealth managers, African-American wealth managers, and really focusing on underserved communities to have that type of opportunity to grow and prepare for life after work is just fantastic. So thank you for that. I'll be looking forward for that amendment. I know we had some conversation. There was some really early communications just to let folks know that this legislation was coming. Again, just thrilled that forethought by you and other members that are working on this piece of legislation is just very helpful. I think it's a great step for us to provide example that there are capable wealth managers, African-American business leaders who are able to lean in and support the state, you know, in some of those, you know, critical ways and that they haven't been able to, or haven't had the opportunity to for years and years in the past. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for leading in on this. And thank you for considering that very important amendment. And again, I stand ready to be supportive in any way that I can from where I sit. Great work. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for the kind words, Mr. Deadweiler. And the reason why I mentioned it at the first meeting, introductory meeting about the legislation, was because of the hard work of you wonderful committee members. You know, we work together. This is a team. The only way we're going to be successful is to unify and to make sure that, you know, we bubble up these issues, these concerns, and to put it in writing and legislation. So, you know, more to come on that. I look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. If there are any other questions, concerns, any other issues, we can adjourn the meeting. Is there a motion to adjourn? And again, thank you. A very special thank you to our guests this evening.
I'll make that motion. So moved.
Thank you. Committee member Deadweiler, is there a second?
A second.
Thank you. Committee member Weatherspoon.
That was Luby.
Meeting is adjourned. Thanks
Yeah,
so
that was
much for all
Luby.
your hard work, and everyone have a nice Memorial Day weekend.